Alright, Protestants, let's get to the root of the issue, sola scriptura. If you're a Protestant, you most likely hold the sola scriptura, which is the belief that the Bible is the only infallible source of authority. Now, at first thought, that seems like a great idea to believe. But the deeper you go with this belief, the more you realize that there's a lot of problems with it. For example, the Bible never once says that it is the only infallible source of authority. If you are using Scripture as the highest authority to obtain all of your foundational beliefs, then Scripture should say that it's the only infallible source of authority. But it doesn't say that. Most Protestants will bring up this verse from 2 Timothy to prove sola scriptura. Yes, I completely agree, all Scripture is inspired by God and it's profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, etc. But this verse does not say that only Scripture is inspired by God and profitable for teaching. Because it's not. We know the Scripture is God-breathed, which is why we call it infallible, but God also breathes on the apostles. And I would say this is because he gives them the authority to speak infallibly. Now, another problem with sola scriptura is that the early Christians were not using the Bible as their main source of authority. They were using the teachings of the apostles and people that knew the apostles and so forth. This is exactly what Paul references in 2 Thessalonians when he says, "So then, brethren, stand firm and hold of the traditions which you were taught by us, either by word of mouth or by letter." Christ taught the disciples for 3 years. There's absolutely no way the Gospels even came close to mentioning all the things that Christ taught them and did. And the Gospel of John admits this. The early Christians weren't opening up their KJV Bible and turning to Romans and reading it in order to understand teachings of Christ. They were learning everything from people that knew the apostles, were taught by the apostles, etc. An official canon of the Bible wasn't established until 382 AD. And this brings us to one of the biggest problems, in my opinion, with sola scriptura. There is no way to be completely consistent in determining which books belong in the Bible. If you claim you uphold the canon that Jesus held to, well, the Jewish canon wasn't even closed during Christ's time, so it doesn't make any sense. And also, it still doesn't solve the problem with the New Testament. If you claim the books of the Bible have to be written by a prophet or an apostle, well, Esther, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes were not written by a prophet. And with the New Testament, we don't even know who the author of Hebrews is. If you want to appeal to tradition and say that you accept the books that the early Christians accepted, well, then you should accept the book of Baruch, because most early Christians accepted that book as scripture. None of the deuterocanonical books contradict the rest of scripture. There is no good reason to deny them. But if you're a Protestant, you can have any canon you want. I've met Protestants that accept the deuterocanonical books, but they reject the book of James. I've met Protestants that say the book of Enoch should be in the Bible. And without a binding church authority, Protestants can do that. Now, the other big issue with sola scriptura is there's no authority to tell you which interpretation of the Bible is correct, which is why thousands of Protestant denominations exist. Because if I go to a church and I disagree with their interpretation of the Bible, well, I can just start my own church. And that's why Protestants still disagree on issues like infant baptism and if you can lose your salvation. But thank God for the Catholic Church. We also have sacred tradition and the church as an infallible source of authority. And these address all of the problems.